Good evening. Good evening, friends and JASA members, and welcome to this evening's JASA event. The Japanese Art Society of America's mission is to promote the study and appreciation of Japanese arts and culture through its annual journal, Impressions, and through programming, including monthly lectures and webinars. I'm delighted to join the JASA Program Committee in welcoming you to this evening's event. Reframing Japonisme, Women and the Asian Art Market in 19th-Century France with Professor Elizabeth Emery. Elizabeth Emery is Professor of French at Montclair State University and is the author of multiple books related to the reception of medieval art and architecture in 19th-century France and America, to the links between early photography and journalism in the creation of French literary house museums, and most recently to Japonisme and the work of women collectors. She is also the author of numerous articles and contributing editor to a long list of publications in French and English on a similarly broad range of topics. And this summer, Professor Emery will be serving as invited scholar at the INHA, or Institut National d'Histoire de l'Art, in Paris, in conjunction with their online biobibliographical program related to collectors and Asian art dealers in France from 1700 to 1939, which is slated to go live in 2022. And I'm sure that this is going to be a resource to which many of us will be turning. We're really delighted to have her with us today to discuss her latest book, Reframing Japonisme, Women and the Asian Art Market in 19th-Century France, 1853 to 1914, which was published by Bloomsbury in 2020. And the work for this book was made possible by a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities. This is, as you'll see, a groundbreaking book which opens up entirely new pathways for our understanding of how, quote unquote, Japanese art became Japanese art in Europe in particular, but which is already having a transformative effect on scholarship in area specialisms further afield. And as you'll have seen, if you have purchased the book, it has been described by Professor Gabriel Weisberg, who's the editor of the Journal of Japonisme, as pioneering in expanding the parameters of the study of Japonisme, and as a work that will fundamentally change the field, by Christopher Reed, who's the author of the 2017 book, Bachelor Japanists, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. Now, as Helen said at the beginning, we're going to use the Q&A box for taking questions during Elizabeth's talk. So you should be able to find that at the bottom of your Zoom screen, the Q&A box. Please put your questions in there as you think of them so that we have a nice queue of questions waiting for Elizabeth after she ends her talk. Elizabeth is going to talk to us for about 30 to 40 minutes, and then we'll have our Q&A session. So Elizabeth, thank you so much for being here with us this evening. I know we're all greatly looking forward to hearing more about your work. And without further ado, I'd like to turn over the virtual podium to you. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank you so much, Dr. Saunders, and thank you so much to the JASA board for inviting me to speak about my new book. It is really a delight to engage with an audience so interested in collectors and collecting. And particularly because Reframing Japonisme focuses on women involved in the 19th century Paris market for Japanese art. So although many of my examples are from the French context, they often intersect with the American collectors with whom you may be more familiar. So if I could begin by asking you to think about the list of women here. And I'm curious how many names on this list you recognize. I suspect that JASA members will know prominent American women, such as Louisine Havemeyer, Isabella Stewart Gardner, perhaps Mary Cassatt, all of whom spent time in France. A number of talented scholars have already brought their Japanese collections to the public eye. But what of the French names here? And I suspect they are not as well known. In France, legal and cultural conventions resulting from the 1804 Napoleonic Code severely restricted married women's ability to own and dispose of property, which means that the legal records do not always capture their activities. So this is in part why the story of the reception of Japanese art in France generally generally credits a very small group of discriminating men with its discovery. And here I'm using an American example, Mary Ainsworth, where we see a similar phenomenon. Men who discover art, discriminating gentlemen, wealthy gentlemen. And so Mary Ainsworth, if you don't know her, ends up being described as exceptional because she's not a wealthy gentleman of aesthetic discrimination. In fact, women like Mary Ainsworth were among the early collectors of Japanese print in the United States as in France. And Roger Keyes makes this clear in saying that she may have been the first American collector who deliberately assembled a historically representative collection of prints in order to teach about it. So the main goal of my book, as the title suggests, is to enlarge this restricted frame through which we still discuss Japonisme today. It is a term first defined by Philippe Burti in 1872, first as a kind of general European fascination with Japanese art and culture, and then progressively as the province of competent men, as you see here. So I revisit this concept by placing Burti and his friends back into the context of their own day, when they worked alongside French women, Japanese nationals, and many others to collect, sell, and promote Japanese art and works inspired by it. So in this book, I've really barely scratched the surface, and I truly hope that the book will encourage many others to recover stories of other figures whose role in Japanese has been similarly obscured by this overly restrictive frame. So what I'd like to do today is to give you a kind of behind the scenes look, as it were, of how I hit upon this topic and some of the tools I used to reconstruct different kinds of objects. I've chosen 3 women who collected different kinds of objects. We have Louise Desois, who was one of the first purveyors of Japanese prints, textiles, ceramics, and decorative objects. Clémence d'Emery, the founder of the present-day Musée d'Emery in Paris, and Margarita Charpentier, who was a tastemaker and patron of French and Japanese artists alike. So you may be wondering, why this topic? Why France? And so the why France is potentially easier because I've been working for many years on topics related to the preservation of cultural heritage in 19th century France, and particularly with respect to medieval art. So this strangely exclusive language that is often used by the Japonistes to refer to their work always struck me as somewhat strange, because most of those who claim to be Japoniste, like Philippe Burti or like Raymond Coquelin here, they were self-taught. They were not interested exclusively in the arts of Japan. And so I was also puzzled by the disconnect between scholarship saying that women were exceptions or anomalies, or that they didn't like Japanese art, when the names of women appear throughout lists of donors to museum collections of Asian art in France. And so despite the prominence of mothers, of sisters, wives in memoirs related to collecting, and despite the presence of models who study objects from the Far East in paintings from the 1960s, women disappear from the official French history of Japanese art collecting as in France, as it was increasingly defined as a professional field, limited to those with the education to participate. History, linguistics, geography, publishing, men. So I've spent about a decade now trying to reconcile what I thought I knew about Japanese from primary sources, letters, memoirs, auction catalogs, with the ways that these specialists like Burti described their own work. And so what I realized is that what we understand today as the formative story of Japanese, this discovery of Japanese prints by a small group of competent men, was itself a strategy that allowed these collectors to serve as the fathers of a new aesthetic field that not even the Japanese had recognized. And in order to make that distinction, they needed to define Japanese art in a way that would be recognizable in the West and that would be distinct from chinoiserie, or small pan-Asian decorative articles that were associated with women and home decorating. So this kind of explains the shift from women who were publicly recognized as collectors of Japanese art in the 1860s. We have here the example of Madame Marinet, who was an art dealer and collector. There's a catalog of her porcelains. And Camille Moreau-Nélaton, who had an exhibit in Rouen last year. She had a very early print collection, which she used to inspire some of her own ceramics. So in the 1860s, they were recognized, but as decorative Japanese objects of indeterminate value flooded the market after the Paris Universal Expositions of 1867 and 78, portraying women as undiscerning consumers and decorators became a way to carve out this more scholarly, artistic, masculine collecting practice, focused largely on ukiyo-e prints. So Christopher Reid has provided many fascinating examples of what he calls this fiction of Japonisme. And what happened with the gendering of certain kinds of objects, it glosses over the fact that men were just as likely to be using mixed East Asian items to decorate their homes and studios. Here we have the collection of Charles Gillot. And it was not always men who sold objects to women, tempting them, as in the well-known Dry Point by Henri Somme, but rather women who sold Japanese goods to men. And if we reread Lady Charlotte Schreiber, who traveled throughout France, we see just how many women she recorded as selling mixed Asian items. Many of the names she lists also appear in exhibition and auction catalogs of the time. So they were actively engaged in family-owned businesses. And Raymond Coquelin, who I mentioned just a minute ago, is a mixed collector, wrote about his collecting practices in his 1930 memoirs. He himself admitted, however, that he despised Japanese imports until he discovered ukiyo-e prints with his wife and fell in love with them in 1891. Now, because his experience began in the 1890s, he lingers on the great art dealers that he knew, and these are the ones that are still recognized today, Sichel, Bing, Hayashi. And it also means that he neglected about 30 years of Japanese collecting history. Only a few names carry through from that first generation, notably a mysterious shopkeeper, Madame Desois, whom he describes as selling Chinese curiosities in a store whose name he incorrectly records as La Porte Chinoise. So one of my first goals in the book was to think about how I could set the record straight, put her back at the center of collecting, Japanese objects in particular, because she was, as other stickers, labels, advertisements show, specialized in Japanese art. Nearly every French and British collector of Japanese art who passed through Paris in the 1860s recorded her name. Her shop, just down the street from the Louvre on the Rue de Rivoli, specialized in textiles, lacquers, prints, ivories, enamels, and furniture. In spite of the many mentions of her shop, the identity behind her married name, no first name, just Madame, had been lost, as they had the extent to which she and her husband were responsible for sparking a Parisian vogue for specifically Japanese imports. And so to what extent did she spark this? I'll give you a few examples here. Now, I suspect that most of you are familiar with the works of Tissot and Whistler, both of whom took inspiration from Japanese objects in the 1860s, and many of whose paintings are currently on display in American collections. Would you be surprised to know that some of the robes, prints, and screens depicted in these paintings came directly from Madame Desois' shop? They did. Contemporary letters and newspaper articles record the two painters' competition to snatch up Japanese items from this new shop, which opened in 1863. Tissot's series of what used to be called Young Ladies Looking at Japanese Objects are known to feature items he had purchased from Madame Desois, and she knew about his paintings as they were progressing. She told others about them. Whistler, too, was said to have spent all of his disposable income purchasing fabrics and lacquered items from Madame Desois, probably at least some of the items featured in Japanese paintings, such as the 1864 Caprice in Purple and Gold, or in others like Purple and Rose. And these are currently on display at the Freer Gallery in Washington. Now, the only extensive physical description we have of Madame Desois, or the only one I have found so far, is from novelist and collector Edmond de Goncourt. He recorded this in a diary entry from 1875, looking back to the 1860s when her shop was new and when Japanese imports were known only to a small club of like-minded artists who gathered in her shop to examine her goods. These descriptions are at the heart of later characterizations of the early Japanese movement as the exclusive purview of these gentlemen of great aesthetic taste. And if we look a little bit closer at the language and about just how he chooses to depict Madame Desois, we see a kind of subtle shift from an active art dealer to the kind of object or model that we see in the Tissot paintings. Right? He focuses on her jewelry. She's an idol, a jovial object among others in her store. He frames the store itself as the beginning point, as a school, but who decorated this school, who taught these artists to understand Japanese prints, how to wear an obi. Goncourt's language praises Madame Desois as a good sport, a jovial creature, a skilled saleswoman, but it also shifts emphasis from that active role as founder of the school and into the model for a painting. Philippe Burti, on the other hand, is very careful to record her importance as the first person to sell him an album of Japanese prints and to explain what was going on inside that album. So for me as a scholar, seeing how important she was from this anecdotal material, it seemed impossible that we didn't know who she was. So I did become slightly obsessed and figured out that if I used the dates, I could triangulate mentions of her husband's death to try to find his death certificate. So I scoured the records of the archives of Paris for a 3-year period and found his death certificate. Dated from February 1870, this then gives the first names, Jean-Baptiste Émile Desois, born in Belgium, and that of his wife, Louise Mélina Chopin Desois. So from that, everything else becomes possible. So it became a lot of legwork: birth, death, marriage, notary records, marriage contracts, Paris, Brussels, the French provinces. I looked at the French ministry records for Yokohama, trying to trace their path. And I had a lot of help from French friends and colleagues who had access to provincial records where they hadn't been digitized. So I was able to establish the broad parameters of the Desois background, which I published last year in a long article in the Journal of Japonese, which, if you don't know it, is actually a wonderful publication for articles related to the reception of Japanese works and a lot of sort of similarly historic recreations of characters involved in Japanese. So for me in this article, I really wanted to be able to confirm that this was not a shop specializing in Chinese objects, as so many people had said. And it turns out that the Desois were quite active in advertising as specialized in Japanese objects, as you can see in these two examples. So I still don't have all the pieces of the puzzle related to their time in Japan, and that's a topic I'm continuing to pursue. If anyone has any good leads for tracing Europeans traveling in and around Japan before 1862, it's a little tricky. But what I can tell you is the wonderful rags to riches story of Louise Desois. So she was orphaned in rural northern France. She traveled east, returned to France with Émile Desois in 1862, when they married, opened their shop, and then the rest is history. She tended the shop, she decorated it, she participated in exhibitions. He traveled back and forth to Japan for stock, which explains why he is so absent from all of these mentions of Madame Desois. When he died in 1870 after an extended illness, Louise continued to run the shop by herself, and she told her clients how to pronounce Japanese words, interpret figures and albums, let them know the timeline when they could expect new shipments of merchandise. She put aside things for special clients, and she bid actively at auctions. So here you can see her bidding with some of the great Japonistes of her day. She was also an extremely successful businesswoman, and although the shop struggled financially at the death of her husband, by the time of her remarriage in 1874, she owned several properties, and her liquid assets were worth 300,000 francs. So in short, Madame Desois truly was a formative figure in the earliest years of what came to be known as Japonisme. She was an art dealer and mentor of the earliest Japanese painters like Tissot and Whistler. She knew about their works and put them in contact with wealthy patrons. But despite all of this work, she was described on her husband's death certificate as having no profession, as you can see. Goncourt's perception of a jovial, passive idol sitting in a store also erases these professional responsibilities I've just laid out. She's building a business, stocking the store, keeping it afloat as a single mother, raising children, cultivating artists and clients. Goncourt clearly had no idea what went on to bring all of these items to market. He practices what Christopher Reid has called the trope of purchase as discovery, a process that renders invisible the many people and processes involved at bringing objects into a store. In addition, Goncourt's nostalgic descriptions of this brotherhood of artists assembled at Madame Desois' feet obscures the fact that the shop was also frequented by women and by foreign tourists. By retrospectively, so in 1875, looking back, he narrows the frame to paint a very lost paradise type picture of the Japanese brotherhood in their little Eden. And because the brothers recorded in such vivid detail the literary and artistic interests of their friends and acquaintances over a 45-year period, it serves as an incredibly valuable historical document. But it's incredibly important to remember that they used the diary to settle scores, to raise their own acumen in the view of their future readers. Edmond is particularly harsh with women and Jewish collectors. And I'll give you just one example of Louise Desois, who is a very important collector of Chinese and Japanese ceramics and a patron of the Impressionist painters. Goncourt dismisses her collecting activities as an excuse to spend time with her lover, Charles Frucy, in shops like Madame Desois and Philippe Sichet's. And you may remember the couple from as key players in The Hair with the Amber Eyes, if you've read Duval's work. So very much like Condon-Vert, the Goncourt brothers characterize the collection of Gisette de Grange, the flirty mistress of Jewish playwright Adolphe d'Emery, in terms of its sensual availability. She invites Jules de Goncourt to come and see her monsters after a late night party, 2 in the morning in 1859. He's flabbergasted to realize that she's not joking. This is not just an invitation, she really has a collection. She's curated 150 mythological creatures from East Asia, placing them on shelves and in vitrines, painting walls, creating special lighting to exhibit them. 2 years later, both brothers record having visited a new installation of this Chinese museum, as they call it, in a new apartment. And it's important to realize it was not a Chinese museum, it was a museum with mixed items, as you can tell from the collection here. So the question might be, why do they call it a Chinese museum? And when looking back to the 19th century, it's important to recognize that the words Chinese or chinoiserie were applied indiscriminately to objects from East Asia, and they carried something of the kind of muddled use of saying, oh, it's Asian today. It wasn't until the 1860s and especially the 1870s that French collectors took pains to distinguish between works of Chinese and Japanese origin. And the general public continued to conflate the two well into the 1890s and 1900s, using the word chinoiserie for women and japonaiserie or japonisme for men. It was used, it was mixed up a lot. But unfortunately, because the Goncourt's quite judgmental accounts of Gisette Desgranges' independent lifestyle, come up and see my monsters, they're among the few that remain, and as a result, they're applied uncritically today to evoke the founder of the collection we now know as the Musée d'Emery. If you haven't guessed, Gisette Desgranges is none other than Clémence d'Emery, the founder of the museum. And the conflict with the Goncourt leads to all kinds of incorrect claims about her background. So Gisette Desgranges becomes Clémence d'Emery when she marries her former lover in 1881. She had been legally separated from her first husband since 1844 at a time when divorce was not possible. Her museum, which she described as having begun when she was a young girl who preferred to spend her pocket money on small sculpted objects rather than on dresses. So in 1861, this collection was exhibited at Drouot Auction House, where it was described as intelligent and rare and wonderful. Her financial independence as a legally separated woman allowed her to continue growing her collection, which was displayed in all of the different homes she owned and in those she shared with d'Emery. By her death in 1898, she had amassed 6,300 Chinese, Japanese, and Indian objects. She built the house you see here with her own money in 1875. She cataloged her collection, commissioned display cases and installations, and bequeathed the entire package to the French state as the nation's first free public museum of East Asian art. Now, we see that she's done all these things. She has a collection. But when the museum opened in 1908, so 10 years after her death, the story of these 50 years of passionate independent collecting and curating were nowhere to be found in the catalog, which attributed the museum to the generosity of Adolphe d'Emery. You see the couple here at left. Despite an excellent 1975 thesis by Chantal Valluy, which credits Clémence with founding the museum, and despite active public outreach by the current curator, Hélène Bayou, the collection begun by Clémence Le Carpentier in the 1840s is still regularly described by other scholars as the work of Adolphe d'Emery or of Georges Clemenceau, who was her executor. People still falsely claim that she had to force it on the government. And in fact, her husband only tolerated her collecting. He did not participate in it at all. So as in the case of Madame Desois, I felt it extremely troubling that such an early collector whose accomplishments were recognized by the 1860s was so completely expunged from the history of her own museum just 10 years after her death. How is it possible that the story of this collection could have become so distorted in the retelling that today reputable sources are still claiming that Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau was responsible for the museum being accepted? It's not true. So once again, I plunged back into the archives, studying massive files in the French National Archives, which document every bit of the correspondence between Clémence d'Emery and government ministers. From her first enthusiastically received proposal to donate parts of our collection to either the new, it was new at that time, Musée Guimet, the National Museum of Asian Arts, or the Louvre, and this is in 1891, to the mutual decision in 1892 to transform her townhouse into a free public museum. Now, the context behind this is that the Louvre had a perpetual lack of space and financial resources, public museums. Her bequest of the house, the collection, and a generous stipend was intended for the creation of a dedicated space on the edge of the popular Bois de Boulogne, where people could come and admire the craftsmanship of these small sculpted objects dedicated to characters and scenes from Far Eastern mythology. And we have here at left, if you heard John Carpenter's JASA talk earlier this year, Shoki, the demon queller. This concept of house and collection was gaining popularity at this time. This is the same time that Henry Cernuschi is establishing his museum, also in Paris. Similar reasons of thematic consistency and space. But unlike Cernuschi, the Musée d'Emery was intended to be free for the public. So she donated not only the house and the collection, but £500,000 francs invested to cover the museum's projected personnel costs and maintenance in perpetuity. Her will simply requested that the collection be preserved in the best possible light. So it's really horrible when people say that, oh, she just abandoned this collection and didn't plan for its life. And the archival materials allow me to correct some of these myths. But what was a true delight is to discover letters such as this one in her own hand, where we can recover some of her personal expressions of love for a collection she considered her daughter. And so this was thanks to the staff at the Musée Guimet, who let me look through the museum archives. It's a treasure trove, boxes and boxes of documents, some of which overlap with the National Archives. But most exciting for me were these handwritten, color-coded ledgers that Clémence d'Emery produced. In them, she inventories the objects she collected, the dealers from whom she purchased them, and the economic value she ascribed to them. So here you have examples of some of the things she purchased from Bing, Hayashi, Madame Longueville, and Madame Desois. They're very idiosyncratic ledgers, mostly because they were serving as an inventory as she created labels to affix to each of these objects. Nevertheless, they're wonderful to read through because occasionally she'll make comments about the conditions of a purchase. They're old, broken, completing a series about a funny story she had with a dealer. And most importantly, she dramatically expands our understanding of the women working in what were called curiosity shops at this time. Because she names them, she makes them visible. The archives also contain a wealth of correspondence, allowing one to trace in minute detail the collection's evolution, from shortly after her remarriage in 1881 to her death in 1898, and the points of friction with the men from the museum establishment who began shaping the museum and buying objects for her in ever greater quantity throughout the 1890s, once she had agreed to the bequest. Searching through newspaper articles, which is now, the digitized newspaper articles make this much easier task, we have a goldmine, interviews with Clémence d'Emery, where she talks about her passion for the collection, describing articles, her vision of the museum itself as a warm and welcoming space where the vitrine will allow visitors to share her own appreciation for these small sculpted objects. During her lifetime, she organized and rearranged objects into different kinds of configurations by color, material, subject matter, myth, in order to highlight their aesthetic interest or to show variations on themes. It was to be a living museum in which visitors could examine the items on their own terms. She specifically intended it as an antidote to the cold and impersonal display strategies then taking hold in Europe, imported from American museums like Boston's MFA. At the time of her bequest, the museum was roundly applauded by the establishment. She was routinely compared to great contemporary collectors, and the magazine Nature even dedicated a long article to the museum. So what happened? Why was her role as collector and curator erased after her death in 1898? Her story forms the backbone of my book, where I discuss various reasons at extremely great length. So today I'll just give you the short answer, which is by dying a year before her husband, it made her collection his, at least from a legal standpoint. The longer answer is that Clémence d'Annery's profile as an independent and outspoken elderly woman fascinated by making and collecting art became a liability. After her death, her husband's family members contested the bequest and smeared her in court and in the press as a nasty woman, interested in artistic pursuits rather than in serving as, quote, a good little housewife. Lawyers argued that the collection was nothing but department store trinkets or the vanity project of an old lady. And this was a very inconvenient image, as collectors of Japanese art were trying to distinguish themselves and professionalize the field by distancing themselves from women and commerce. The Louvre had opened its first tiny wing dedicated to Asian arts only in 1893. So you can kind of see the image problem that gets brushed under the rug. Despite the fact that it was Clémence d'Annery who corresponded with the French Ministry of Arts, who cataloged her collection, commissioned the installation, she's still represented today as a famous actress who exploited her husband's wealth to pursue a vanity project. And in reality, this is not true. She wasn't an actress, a famous actress. She descended from an affluent family of noble origin, lived in comfort. She was contracted into a respectable bourgeois marriage in 1841. When she met d'Annery, she helped launch his career and manage his affairs. So until they married in 1881, shortly after her first husband's death, it was Clémence who managed her own rental properties and stock portfolio. So while it's popular to focus on a woman's work and women's collections as sensual, the problem is that it shifts attention onto their bodies or their feelings rather than their acumen, and it trivializes them in ways that we don't apply to men's collecting practices. Representing a museum as a cabinet of curiosity created by a sexy woman will draw visitors, but it doesn't inspire confidence in the museum's holdings, some of which, like the 17th century Japanese trunk and thousands of netsuke, rank among the museum's treasures. They're still arranged today, if you don't know this museum, as curator Émile Day left them in 1908. And the museum is still free, though visits are limited, conducted in French, and they must be reserved in advance. And so with these two examples, I suspect you're detecting a pattern of formative women collectors and dealers who were recognized in their time, but then relegated to oblivion as the official origin story of Japonisme, this pursuit of wealthy gentlemen of great aesthetic discrimination, took hold. These new stories replaced the older stories, which did acknowledge that men and women collected, exhibited, and sold their collections side by side. And what I find quite interesting about Japonisme is because it's so recent, from 1872, we can actually trace this process of rewriting as it happened. Memoirs, archives, letters, magazine and newspaper articles show how this small group of men created a Western definition of Japanese art, not recognizable in Japan, largely to insulate the new field from its associations with women in commerce, and to convince the museum establishment of its value. So legal and social conventions, combined with these narratives promoting some groups over the others, have created the impression that women were not interested in or did not collect or sell Japanese items. In fact, they did, but as that criteria for being called a collector or an art dealer shifted to encompass only men who published articles, any of the poorly educated or non-French speaking men and women no longer qualify. These are the kinds of issues that art historian Linda Nochlin addressed in her famous "Why Are There No Great Women Artists" article. And it's wonderful because right now there's a huge expanding study of forgotten women, going back to the archival materials. So my last case study is serving as a bit of a conclusion, is of Marguerite Lemonnier Charpentier. And it evokes the experience of bourgeois women who served as hostesses for their husbands, organizing dinners and social events that served as kind of patronage networks. And they've done this, but they're not generally recognized for their own interest in the art that surrounded them. So Marguerite Charpentier was the daughter of a famous jeweler and wife of Georges Charpentier, who published Émile Zola, the Goncourt brothers, and notable texts related to Japan. Her name may be familiar because of the 1878 Renoir portrait at the Metropolitan Museum in New York. It was known in its day for having preserved a record of the Japanese salon, the Japanese salon that she installed in their home on the Rue Grenelle. And you can see in the far background 4 kakemono. Now, she and Charpentier, who married in 1871, were early enthusiasts of Japanese culture and art inspired by it. To give just one example, their home was the setting for the first performance in 1874 of a play by poet Ernest d'Hervilly. It's the first play in France known to have featured Japanese characters, even though they were played by French actors. And the play was dedicated to Marguerite Charpentier. Now, the invitation card gives a sense of the superficiality of what was a one-act farce set in Japan. The characters have silly names, Sayonara, Typhoon, and they're played by French actors. But not everything is fantasy here. And so it's kind of interesting to look at the kanji in top left, which may have been copied, as my colleague Yaoi Olenek has proposed, from a kabuki print. It's funny to see, right, how either the tracer and engraver got them backwards. I'm working on the play in a different context, but I mention it to give a sense of how this taste making occurred. Newspapers were not at all impressed by the play, which they thought was a farce, but they raved about the costumes and the sets, which were pulled from local collections of Japanese fabrics, screens, ceramics, and pipes. It's not clear how valuable these items were, but the event would have introduced a large and affluent audience to authentic Japanese objects at a time when there were no museums displaying these objects. Private homes served as de facto museums. The first Paris Museum of Asian Art, the Musée Guimet, only opened 15 years after this event. So the Charpentier entertained lavishly. They forged all kinds of networks of sociability that brought together writers, artists, politicians, and foreign dignitaries. Edmond de Goncourt was a regular at their home, and he chronicles many of the events that took place there, though, as he did for the other women we've seen, he objectifies Marguerite Charpentier, describing her as little, childlike, or as a cutout cardboard figure. So we have to read between the lines of his descriptions, where we see that this was no passive figure. The dinners that the Goncourt brothers enjoyed at the Charpentier's home did not arrive by magic any more than the objects they enjoyed at Madame de Soie's shop arrived by magic. It was Marguerite Charpentier who set the guest lists, who planned the menus, who organized activities. Goncourt finds it funny when she lectures a group of writers about trying to remain polite to the politicians who were there with them. He doesn't realize that she's orchestrated the event to help advance their careers. So these dinners served as networking events, not just for French writers, but also for Japanese visitors. Now in 1878, the Charpentier hosted another dinner, this time with Japanese artists, in conjunction with the Paris World's Fair of that year. If you have read Kit Brooks' article in the most recent issue of Impressions, you'll be familiar with the work of Watanabe Seitei and also perhaps with the Paris dinners, during which Seitei and Yamamoto Hosui performed demonstrations of Japanese painting techniques and then gifted the resulting works to members of the French audience. the Charpentier sponsored one such event on November 5th, so a few weeks before the one that resulted in this drawing. And it was accompanied by samples of Japanese cuisine, sushi and sashimi, likely prepared by Yamamoto, whom Takashina Erika has identified as a fine cook, a recognized cook. Goncourt describes this foreign food in detail. He appreciates its complexity and delicacy, even if he doesn't appreciate the flavor. But what really fascinates him in his account of this evening is the two painters' technique, and particularly their seemingly uncanny ability to improvise complex perspectives without resorting to preliminary sketches. So I won't linger on these examples. If you're interested, Manuela Mosquitiello has described them in great length. But what I would like to emphasize is how impressed the French were with the skill of the Japanese artists. And such social situations fostered the kinds of cross-cultural encounters that don't often appear in the written accounts of the discovery, purchase, and collecting of Japanese works in the West. The fact that guests such as Goncourt and Degas reported their admiration and astonishment, and that they retained the demonstration gifts, shows how important they found this experience and the work of Seite and Yamamoto. And so I'm saying that the importance of these patronage networks that are essentially invisible shouldn't be discounted. Mosquitiello has shown how the Charpentier, like their close friends and publishing collaborators, Émile Bergerac and Estelle Gauthier, subsequently helped both Yamamoto and Seite obtain commissions for work in Paris. This is an entry from an 1886 dictionary where we can just see that the French and Japanese artists are included side by side. Yamamoto later decorated the home of Judith Gauthier, sister of Estelle Bergerac, and herself the author of a novel set in Japan. These are some of the decorations of her home. The many thank you notes sent from Japanese exchange students to Philippe Burti's wife, Euphrosine, similarly suggest kind of rich, invisible connections not often mentioned in official stories about the discovery of Japanese art in the West. To thank the Burti for their hospitality, these young students often offer to help with translations or to send them material from Japan once they had returned. So if I conclude with these examples of Japanese artists active in Paris and working alongside their French peers, it is as a further way of thinking about ways to reframe Japanese. And I truly hope that these case studies drawn from women collectors, art dealers, and tastemakers in 19th century Paris have convinced you that when we read that it was exceptional for 19th century women to collect Japanese prints, or that Western artists learned techniques only from studying the ukiyo-e prints in their collection, we might pause for a moment to think about how such histories tend to be written from the perspective of those in power at a given moment. My book was intended as a starting point to encourage others to look at existing evidence from different angles and to return to archival sources with fresh eyes. So I invite you all to continue expanding the framework through which we currently represent the story of Japanese. Thanks.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for that incredibly rich presentation. I'm very struck listening to this story, particularly of Clémence d'Emery and her visionary bequest for the museum, not only the museum and her collection, but taking care of it in perpetuity, an incredible vision in 1893, really startling. And I'm thinking of Isabella Stewart Gardner around the same time, and I think that's maybe something we could get to in the Q&A, but that was fantastic. It was a wonderful introduction to your book and to your work. So thank you so much. I think for me, what your work exposes is a really important part of the process of institutionalization of knowledge about what we've been calling Japanese art in the West, and which we often sort of consume, at least we think we do, at face value. But in fact, your work is really throwing a lot of light onto that sort of habituated categorization by revealing the role of Japonisme in the formation of that category itself of Japanese art in the West. And that's very important for those of us engaged in curating and collecting and researching Japanese art or works of art made in Japan, outside Japan. And a part of the story that's often left untouched because Japonisme is a Western construct, and so or a concept, and it gets left to the province of historians of Western art and literature in particular, rather than being taken up sort of wholeheartedly by those of us who are immersed more in working with works of art from Japan. And your book does a fantastic job of revealing that double entanglement, or double, triple, maybe more, quadruple entanglement, of that sort of simultaneous fascination with and appropriation of Japan, the sort of fantasy place in the 19th century, and how that sort of influenced what became Japanese art in the West and how it happened. And at the same time that you're sort of bringing this much more nuanced and tightly focused view of Japonisme into view, you're also decolonizing this very problematic concept from the inside out and revealing these women who've been literally written out of the story. And also, of course, Japanese individuals, dealers active in Europe and in Japan. At the same time as you're sort of revealing this constellation of other kinds of behaviors and perspectives that are entirely unacceptable to us today, but they still lie there kind of unspoken, mostly behind this rather benign seeming story of Japonisme and Japan's sort of rather delimited role in the development of modernism, for example. So I think it's a study with a lot of implications and opens a lot of doors, as you're saying, to revealing other people, other stories, other histories that have been sort of pruned out of this linear story that we tend to consume. We have a lot of great questions coming in the Q&A box. Don't think we're going to get to all of them, so we're going to try and save them and pass them on to you afterwards, if that's okay. We're getting a lot of applause and praise in the chat as well, so I'm just trying to follow both at the same time. But we have a question here about Monsieur Desois, who went to Japan, and you said as early as 1862. And the questioner wonders, was he in some way involved in the silk industry and in efforts to acquire silkworms from Japan?
So that is a very good question, and it makes a lot of sense given his name, silk. I don't know, because I've not been able to find records. The records I do have are newspaper articles. They're anecdotal about his having come back and going back and forth. And so it's not entirely clear. I found no records of him in Yokohama, but those are partial records. And it's possible that he came in from a different trajectory. I don't think he was involved in this. If he could have been involved in the silk industry, but I don't have records of that. He came from a working class family in Belgium, so he would not have been part of a large family enterprise at any rate. So that's a very incomplete answer, but there's a lot still to be discovered. And if you leave your name and I find out, I'll let you know.
You're very glancingly referred to some of the research that you've had to do as sort of taking 3 years and requiring obsession and visiting many archives in Paris. I can see that you're just stroking the surface there with that answer again, but it must have been an incredible journey to tell this new story, where you've had to go outside institutionalized records and find new sources and new ways to access things. Is there anything additional that you might want to share about that? Anything particularly surprising or something serendipitous or particularly difficult?
I would say just because of, the impossible nature of the task makes me work in a way that I would never have dreamed of working, which is to just cast this huge net to try to find even the smallest details. And the serendipity of that is that one finds all kinds of odd bits and pieces of stories that that one wouldn't expect. And so I'm trying to think of a good example. Well, just somebody sends William Michael Rossetti sends him a letter to his mother talking about his time in Paris. And he says, oh, there's this great new shop I've been in. And this woman was telling me all this gossip about what Whistler's doing and who has the most Japanese prints in Europe. And I was like, oh, fantastic, right? So I have some kind of concrete evidence. But it also means that the story is partial. So it casts a wide net, but it brings back only tiny fishes, delicious fishes.
Interesting. So it requires a lot of patience and persistence. Yeah, I can only imagine. We have a great question here about the differences between what was happening in America or the New World and European patterns of women collecting in Japanese or Asian art. Do we see big differences in what's happening for women in France and say women in North America or other places that you're aware of?
Yes. The cultural specificity of legal systems in particular makes France quite different. The remarkable restrictions on, it really is, the Napoleonic Code is responsible for all of these fantastic archival materials that I'm able to find in France because so many things are preserved. On the other hand, by considering women as minors, it really takes away the kinds of record keeping we find in other places and their access to pocket money. The reason Madame d'Emery was able to acquire this collection is because she was legally separated. Her money was separated from her first husband, which is not always the case. I mean, there are coverture laws in different places, but it's not the same kind of restrictive. And if you don't have money, you can't have a collection. You can ask your husband or your father, but then it becomes their collection. So it's a very fraught situation in France that I do think differs. And I think that each national tradition depends on the timing. What were the laws in place? What was the status of women? Was the woman widowed? And so there are incredible complexities that come out of that. So it's a fascinating question. And so that was a long answer. The short answer is yes. I think there are some similarities in terms of the networks of purchases, but they're very different in the way that women were able to control a collection.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. We are very nearly at time, but there is a question that follows almost perfectly from that one, from Emery Garcia Rodriguez. Asking, is there information about the commercial networks these women Japonists use to purchase or import Japanese objects into France? And she's asking because it could be interesting for you to know that in Argentina and Chile, I found cases of women collectors of Asian/Japanese art at the beginning of the 20th century. So maybe this is a conversation to be continued.
Absolutely, that is fascinating. No, I'm working on that, and there are others working on that. So one of the surprising import networks before there's a kind of an official network is actually auctions. So military personnel, travelers will come and accumulate cases and cases of objects. And so the auction records that I showed you are a good example. So these men would return, sell an auction of what they had accumulated during that trip before they went back. So that's one it's an established channel, but it's a very informal network.
Fascinating. Fascinating. Thank you, Elizabeth. It's sad to say we've reached 6 o'clock, which is the witching hour for us, but it's clear that there's a lot more to say here, and that there's some really great questions here. We're going to try and save them and pass them on to you after we finished here. So thank you so much, Elizabeth, for this wonderful lecture. It's fascinating. You're saying it's just the beginning. I'm thinking it's the beginning of something bigger. But thank you so much for being here this evening and sharing your work with us.
And thank you for the excellent questions and the moderation.
Absolutely, and I want to thank our audience too for joining us this evening. And I'm sure we're all going to be considering this as a lot of food for thought as we go forward. The next JASA event is coming up in June, and it's not one, but it's two webinars. It's a two-part series on the analytical study of pigments in Japanese paintings and prints with Marco Leona, who's the David H. Koch scientist in charge of the Department of Scientific Research at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And these two webinars, which are titled Looking at Art Through the Lens of Scientific Analysis, are going to take place on Wednesday, June 9th and Wednesday, June 16th at 5 p.m. The first webinar is going to be devoted to blue, and the second, which is being co-presented with Henry Smith, Professor Emeritus of Columbia University, is devoted to red. We very much hope that you will be able to join us for these sessions, which are going to be a rare chance to see through the eyes of a conservation scientist. Be well and good night.